Good evening, everyone. Time for another silver update. This is the daily chart of silver provided by netdania.com. You can click on the link below. And I've drawn the fairly long-term trend line here. The primary trend actually goes all the way back to the bottom back in 2008. Doesn't quite meet up with where we're at, but you can see they're pretty close. So we've been consolidating in this long, drawn out, very long pennant formation, and we did a test up above it and then fell back below it, and you can see we're rounding off up towards the top of it and looking to see whether we break out above that or if we just further consolidate. So this is a very large formation. It's now over a year since the top. Well, actually, that was in May. So we're approaching a year on this formation as far as the down leg of it. The up leg of it, you can see, goes for many years. So it's a steady gain. Now, I wanted to jump over to the oil chart because first I'm going to look at a story. We had a story that came out that Obama has proposed that they're going to try to rein in the oil speculation, and that news hit the wires within the last 24 hours or so. So it appears to be some type of election strategy trying to imply that the rise in oil prices is due to the evil speculators. You can see that it says, under pressure to bring down the high price of gas, President Obama and Attorney General Eric Holder will outline a proposal Tuesday to increase federal supervision of the oil markets in an effort to clip the wings of speculators who are profiting off the volatility of the oil market. So, and we're going to cover this later about these sociopaths in government, but here are the sociopaths in government. They've got a convenient scapegoat. It's the evil speculators who are profiting off the volatility of the oil market. That's very interesting. They're not saying it's the speculators that are driving the prices up. Of course, it's the prices rising that causes the gas price to be high, not the volatility. So that's just kind of silly there. And it says the president's $52 million plan would let regulators force energy traders to put more of their own money into trades. So that's basically raising the margin requirement, and boost the penalties on manipulators who are found to be speculating unlawfully, according to a senior administration source who would not comment. And it goes into the details of this, and it's really just a bunch of nonsense and scapegoating of speculators. Of course, they don't want to talk about the real issue, and I'm going to look at the real issue here. But what's interesting is if we look over here at the crude oil chart, you can see the daily, we're in a fairly decent rally right here, and not only that, we have a fairly strong crossover just below the zero line appearing here. So it may end up that the president is going to have a lot of egg on his face here as the market participants bid the price of oil up in dollars, and we may actually get new highs out of this. So that would be pretty embarrassing. Of course, let's look over to the facts of the matter, and this is really simple to find. It was mentioned by James Turk in my interview of him, and when I asked him about the inflation, deflation, and he said, inflation or deflation in terms of what? What's your measuring stick? So this is an example of the measuring stick. This is crude oil, and it is crude oil in grams of gold. So you can see this chart is from the 1950s to March 2012. So it's fairly recent. And you can see we're pretty much flatlined. It seems that 2.5 grams is roughly the normal level for this. The article writer says this chart shows that these oscillations are part of a sideways price movement centered around 2.5 grams per barrel. Crude's current price is 2 grams, a bit below its long-term average. Of course, the fluctuating value of the dollar makes it very hard to gauge whether oil prices themselves are rising or falling. Oil today at 2 grams is about the same as it was in the early 1950s. But if you measure the price in US dollars, you would get the impression that it is about 30 times more expensive today. So of course, the sociopaths in government are never going to admit to you that the rising price of gas and the rising price of oil really has to do with the debasement of the dollar. It's the currency that's being measured in that's falling in value. Oil is pretty much holding steady in its measurement in gold. Now I wanted to address the stories that have come out. I'll go over to the question of the night, and actually that's about the silver stockpiles. We've seen these stories hit recently. The Reuters has reported that the COMEX is saying stockpiles are up 28% for the year. And then we get this article. Now it's interesting because the article says corrected, changes headline. First paragraph shows silver stocks at highest level since at least December of 2009, not record high. So the initial article apparently said that silver stockpiles had hit record highs. Then they backed off to say since December 2009. You can see the number they're citing here is 141.59 million ounces, and the lowest in a decade was 97.86 million ounces. Now there's a newer story that came out today, and that is a story also on Reuters, and this one says COMEX silver stockpiles at highest in a decade. Silver stockpiles, COMEX monitored warehouses rose to their highest level in 10 years, showing near-term supply of the metal is plentiful as mine output holds at record levels and the global economic recovery struggles for traction. So now we get our numbers again here, and some key figures that you get are the stockpiles are 141 million ounces of silver. Now if you do the math on that at the current price, that's about $4.5 billion. So the entire stockpile of the COMEX of silver is about $4.5 billion. That's kind of an interesting number, because if you multiply that number times 365, you get about the $1.6 trillion deficit that the United States is running. So in essence, every day the United States is borrowing the entire value of this entire stockpile. So that shows you what a tiny figure that really is. Then we've got this 284 million, that's the high mark, and then we've got this 97.86 million ounces. And that's very interesting because they mention the fact that stocks fell to their lowest level in nearly a decade at 97.86 million ounces last June, shortly after prices crashed spectacularly from record highs near $50 an ounce, shedding a third of their value in just 6 sessions. So one would assume that there was a tremendous amount of silver out there, that finally people decided to unload all that silver that they had been stockpiling or whatever they'd been doing with it and dump it on the COMEX, except of course the exact opposite happened, that the stockpiles on the COMEX ended up being at record lows. You would expect them to be at record highs if there's an oversupply of silver and people are dumping it, which is causing the price to fall. So obviously that's just a big manipulated game, and these stockpiles are really pretty much meaningless. I think it's interesting that Reuters decided to make this a big story. It's a big story in other places. Of course, we never did have a story about how silver was the best returning asset number of years running. The only time the media decides to cover silver is when it's negative news or propaganda. So That's pretty obvious to anybody who has been watching what the media does with these stories. Now, I wanted to show you real briefly the supply and demand picture. You can see the article mentioned that 770 million ounces was the amount that 2011 was going to show to be mined. If you take this 606 number and you take a regular percentage gain to get to last year's 770 million, you come out with roughly 2.5 to 2.7 percent gain per year. In other words, the amount of silver that's being mined is growing just a little over 2.5%. If you look at the amount of silver that's being used in industrial demand, it's growing at quite a bit faster pace. But you can see that these are nowhere any kind of wild numbers or anything. Just the growth in the Silver Eagle program alone is enough to take up that excess supply that they're talking about. So in my mind, that's just a big non-story, just something that they throw out there to the oil story and the silver story. The oil is not being manipulated. It's a real market, while the silver is being manipulated and it's being suppressed. So, of course, the media has it 100% backwards. And that's not really surprising. I'm going to take you over to the story of the night. This is Doug Casey on Zero Hedge. And Doug Casey pretty much hits the nail on the head. The people that are running things in government, these people are sociopaths. He debates whether these people are knaves or fools, and he gives examples of both. I'm just going to read a little bit of this. It's an excellent article. I suggest you read the whole thing. And I'll start here with moral and intellectual bankruptcy. One element of moral bankruptcy is intellectual bankruptcy, to wit, belief in the effectiveness of statism and collectivism. This is one reason why I counsel kids who are thinking of going to college, unless it's to acquire some very specific knowledge in science, engineering, medicine, or the like, to do something more intelligent with their time and money. The higher education system is totally controlled and populated by morally and intellectually bankrupt instructors who are believers in socialism. It's said Obama is a socialist. I don't doubt he's sympathetic to socialism, but to be true to the meaning of words, he's a fascist. Let's define these terms in two others with a little help from Karl Marx. His recommended solutions are part of the world's problems, but his analysis of conditions was often quite astute. As Marx pointed out, political systems are all about the ownership and control of goods, whether consumer goods, houses, cars, clothes, toothbrushes, or capital goods, farms, factories, and other means of production. Although he didn't break it down this way, his analysis gives us four possible economic systems: communism, socialism, fascism, and capitalism. A communist advocates state ownership and control of all the means of production and all consumer goods. That's a practical impossibility. Of course, even in the most primitive aboriginal bands, the idea is even more absurd and preposterous for an industrial society. But that doesn't keep professors and politicians from pretending that it's a good idea, even if just in theory. A socialist advocates state ownership of society's means of production, but accepts private ownership with state control of consumer goods. While it's a big improvement over communism, socialism is also completely impractical and always either collapses or evolves into fascism. North Korea, and now to a lesser degree Cuba, are the world's only socialist states. A fascist advocates nominal private ownership of both the means of production and consumer goods, but with strong state control over both. In other words, you can own mines, farms, and factories, but the state reserves the right to tax, regulate, and even expropriate them. Fascism has nothing to do with jackboots and black uniforms. You can have those in communist and socialist states as well. It has to do with a corporate state and a revolving door between business and government, with each protecting and enriching the other. Fascism can be maintained for a long time, but necessarily entails all the problems we now face. Almost all of the world's states are fascist today. They differ only in degree and detail. A capitalist advocates the private ownership of everything. An extreme capitalist may be an anarchist who believes that anything people need or want should be and would be provided by entrepreneurs at a profit. No country provides a perfect example of any of these four arrangements, but every government promotes one or the other as a theoretical idea. In most places, certainly including the U.S., the mixed economy is put forward as a good thing. The mixed economy is a polite way of describing fascism. Nobody wants to call fascism by its name today because of its strong association with Hitler's National Socialists. In any event, look and analyze closely before you use these words and attach any of the four tags to any country. In that light, it's funny how the Chinese are still referred to as communists, even though communism was tried only briefly under Mao. In fact, up to the mid-80s, China was a socialist state. Now it's a fascist state. China's Communist Party is just a scam enabling its members to live high off the hog. Sweden is usually referred to as a socialist nation, but it's always been a fascist country. All of its means of production, businesses, factories, farms, mines, and so forth have always been privately owned but heavily taxed and regulated. The presence of lots of free welfare benefits is incidental. People often conflate a welfare state with socialism, but they're two different things. Socialist states necessarily become too poor to provide any welfare. Fascist states can better afford it and usually offer some in order to help justify the government's costly and annoying depredations. There's no truly capitalist state in the world today. Perhaps Hong Kong comes closest, although not very close. Now, I would disagree with that. I think that he's correct that China is essentially fascist at the upper levels, but I would say in the unregulated free markets in the lower levels of business, especially your ability to just throw up a sign and to have a business, basically start your own business and put up a sign, is very simple in China. There's virtually no regulation, so I would say that on that level, China is probably the closest to capitalist. Maybe Hong Kong and the rest of Asia would be areas that would be closest to capitalist right now. The early U.S. came quite close in some regards. In fact, the West as a whole was quite free in the century from the fall of Napoleon in 1815 to the start of World War I. And he goes on. So I'm going to cover the political parties that he talks about and then go to his conclusion because it's a very long article. In reality, there's little philosophical difference between the Republicrats and the Demopublicans. They're really just two wings of the same party. The left wing of the party claims to believe in social freedom, but doesn't, and overtly disbelieves in economic freedom. The right wing says it believes in economic freedom, but doesn't, and overtly disbelieves in social freedom. The right wing uses more aggressive rhetoric to build the warfare state. The left wing talks more about the welfare state. But the net difference between them is minuscule. That's because they share the same corrupt intellectual and moral views. What made America unique was its foundation in a philosophy of freedom. That word, however, has become so corrupted that the younger Bush was able to use it 24 times in some of his early speeches without being laughed off the stage or targeted with shoes and rotten vegetables. Perversely but predictably, Bush is today presented as by the mainstream media as a free marketer in order to pin the blame for the current depression on the free market. This is as much of a hoax as calling Hoover a supporter of the free market. One is forced to acknowledge a bit of respect for Obama's intellectual honesty in that he almost never speaks of freedom or liberty. Now, Casey goes on to describe the fool and the knave. He pretty much is convinced that Bush was a very low, sub-100 IQ fool, while Obama, being fairly intelligent, is more of a knave. So let's go to his conclusion. And conversely, statism and collectivism, by restricting liberty, tend to reward stupidity. Remember that political leaders are oriented toward controlling other people. They're clever about it. but they're basically stupid about the rest of reality. Nonetheless, their animal shrewdness is enough for them to gain and keep power over others. The immediate and direct consequence of that political power are gratifying for those who have it. The indirect and delayed consequences, however, are disastrous for everyone. But wait, it sounds like stupidity is related to evil. Which is it? Stupidity is a signpost of evil. It's why it often takes a while when things are going badly to determine whether you're dealing with a knave or just a fool. In that regard, Robert S. McNamara offers something of a counterpoint to Bush. When you look at the disasters he caused throughout his life, almost destroying Ford, then almost destroying the U.S. in the Vietnam War, then doing immense damage to the world at large with the World Bank, one might say he was stupid. In fact, he had an extremely high IQ. McNamara underlines the often fine distinction between stupidity and evil. He was clearly a sociopath, but he's held in high regard among the ruling class. Henry Kissinger is a similar case. Evil. I would like to suggest that what really distinguishes political elites from normal people is not just a predilection for stupidity, but a real capacity for evil. Evil might best be defined as the intentional and usually gratuitous commission of acts that are cruel and unjust. A person who commits many evil acts is a sociopath. The sociopaths who are naturally drawn to government eventually come to dominate it. They're very dangerous people. They reset the social mores of the country they control. After a certain point, a critical mass is reached and it's game over. I suspect we're approaching that point. So, an excellent article from Doug Casey. I don't agree 100% with everything that Doug Casey says. I don't agree 100% with everything that the Dollar Vigilante, Jeff Berwick, or tends to be more in the anarchist camp than others, or Simon Black. I don't agree with everything all of them say, but again, that's excellent analysis by Doug Casey. He pretty much has a neutral perspective as far as the left or the right, and shows them pretty much being in bed together as far as running this ship of state into the ground. So back to the silver price. Short term, we seem to be rounding up a little bit, and we're just coming towards some type of resolution for this very, very large pennant or triangle formation that we have here. And of course, that is a very good stacking price if you're not distracted by the massive stockpiles that are being reported on the COMEX, which in my opinion is just a bunch of smoke and mirrors. And we'll talk to you next time.